So when I was invited to this talk, I was quite fascinated by the theme, boundary, because as a designers, that's something that we deal with on a daily basis. So you see boundaries could be physical. As you see in this picture, is a suburban gated community outside of Beijing. You see multiple layers of a divide, vertical walls in the city. So that's a physical boundary. It could be intangible, conceived and perceived in someone's mind only, even though it has the dangerous potential to become real. So unfortunately, those two quick examples showed us how boundaries could make the world more segregated and less diverse, even though in general, to us, boundaries help us delineate and differentiate things in the context, so the world could be more diverse. And let's do something fun. It's not rocket science, so don't overthink. Just trust your eyes. So raise your hands if you think the second red line or the middle line is longer than the rest. Raise your hands if you think the middle one is longer. So I see some hands, okay. But the reality is the red lines are the exact same length. So all three of them are the same. And let's look at MC Escher's classic mind-boggling piece, Relativity. In this drawing, you see each stairway is perfectly logical, but once you see the whole picture, we're baffled how different universes can coexist without even a clear spatial boundary. You see, they're logical, but the whole picture doesn't make sense. And it's getting more fun. Now wake up. Raise your hands if you can recognize this celebrity. Okay, I'm going to turn this photo upside down 180 degrees. So sometimes our perceptions can be deceiving. Now, I showed you the physical boundaries. I showed you perceived boundaries. They're not always aligned. This happens to our cities as well. This could be anywhere in China. If I review the second part of the city, it shows how our cities have expanded. It's one of the typical urban fabric that we see today in most of the Chinese cities. And unfortunately, this is how we accept the preconceived notion that we need to divide the land. We need to impose boundaries first so we can have a rule to follow. This is not different from the upside-down picture that I showed you, and we assume that we're doing the right thing. So in logic, it's almost the same. So to me, as a designer, the cities look very raw, unfriendly, and flavorless. So it's as if, as a planner, as a designer, I serve you a dish of separated ingredients. There's no flavor. In order to have a flavor, you need that mix. You need that interaction. You need that magical chemical reaction. This needs to happen in the city as well. So in the result, this is what our cities look like today. This is a corner of Shanghai. You see the urban fabric is both homogeneous and fragmented. And the high-density vertical development as another layer of boundary on top of natural boundary. So the otherwise beautiful water edge is dwarfed by these towers. And this is supposed to be the biggest residential block in Changsha. So align the entire waterfront, you see a solid wall. Why are we doing this to our cities? It has a history in China. Since the 1950s, the Soviet Union inspired or influenced urban planning has dominated Chinese cities for decades. And with monumental wide roads and boulevards lined with compounds after compounds, government departments and military agencies normally acquire big swaths of land by providing their employees and their residents with a wide array of different amenities, simply as a sign or symbol of a privilege. There's another reason behind this, especially in the recent decades, where you see more and more gated residential communities. And this graph shows that most of the local governments get about 20% of their revenue from land leasing. So this is their favorite model, by efficiently outsource outsourcing land to private developers, so they can share some of the cost and for infrastructure development. And so that's what our cities look like today. So urban traffic congestion has become a conundrum for almost every city. So we keep on building more lanes, wider roads, but the traffic gets worse. And one of my colleagues has a really good metaphor. He was saying that keep on adding more wider roads to deal with the traffic. It's like someone keep loosening his belt to deal with overweight. And even when there's no traffic, this is an early shot in one of the neighborhoods in Beijing. You see there's no urban life, there's no street life, and there's no interaction, no connectivity along the street. And what are we trying to protect us from with 3 layers of walls in such a simple street? And the neighbors are not even interacting to each other. And you will notice that there's a narrow stretch of green sandwiched between the wall and the sidewalk that is not accessible, not recreational, not even visible to most of the residents behind the walls. And this is extremely inefficient, ineffective in a city that is starving for open space. And so where is this going? Now we see the trend, we see the history, we see the impact, we see the problems. Let's look at the evolution of land use planning in Chinese cities quickly. So from the graph, you see clearly that the trend that is from completely segregation of different land uses. Industrial is here, open space park is here, and the residential is here, towards a better integration and a synergy among them all. And today, and you all know the top-down term from the Central Chinese government is called 产城融合 or 产学研融合. That means different land uses, different urban functions need to talk to each other, need to interact with each other, almost like cooking. You're creating that chemistry, that reaction, so you can add more flavor to the cities. And just last spring in 2016, the central government announced to ban all the future gated communities and gradually open the existing ones, mainly to alleviate traffic pressure. But we all know that traffic congestion is just one of the symptoms. It's not the core problem. And we notice some of the developments that they're not designed to face outside. They're very inward facing. They're not designed to interact with the river, with the outside of the urban fabric. And let's look at what else is needed for the cities. There isn't a clear answer or for all. We can use LEED, one of the rating systems for sustainable design and development. Let's look at some of the simple prerequisites to see where we are or where the Chinese cities are. And there are 2 examples among many to measure the connectivity and the openness of a neighborhood, of a community. One is the density of intersection in the proximity of the neighborhood. And the second one is proximity to open space for 90% of the residents. So to be eligible, you need 54 intersections per square kilometer. That's just a benchmark. But let's look at the same example that I showed you earlier. The city has only 14 intersections. This new so-called eco-city is only about a quarter of the baseline for LEED. And the question mark, you'll see that the rivers, the open space, has no connection to the large gated community at all. And there's an 8-lane road separating the river from the neighborhood. So the mental distance is much longer, even though you can see the river, but it's not accessible. So now I'm going to share with you a few examples of our own practice, how designers deploy concept of a boundary to promote a stronger public realm and advocate for ecology. So this is Green Acre Park in New York City, in Manhattan, that we did in the 1970s. This was one of the earlier prototypes of new public space, even though as part of the privately owned residential neighborhood. It was not completely gated at all. Instead, it opened to the public. And 40 years later today, it's still one of many people's favorite open space in New York. And we can ask John if that's true. This picture of Chicago Riverwalk taken 7 years ago. So as you see, the hostile urban waterfront that is supporting no activities. They're attracting no pedestrians or wildlife, many levels. But this is what it looks like today. And for designers like us, we see the edges, we see the boundaries as opportunities where you bring different experiences, different energies to converge, to collide, to have that chemical reaction, to add flavor to the cities. And still the linear, narrow edge now is being celebrated as a urban destination, one of the most popular ones in Chicago. This is what it looks like today, with the various activities through different seasons and different time of the day. And the next one is Suzhou Creek, and many of you may have been to Shanghai. Suzhou Creek is the most historical water course meandering through the oldest part of Shanghai, the core of downtown. And for a long time, for generations, the Suzhou Creek has been credited as one of the drivers behind modern industrialization in Shanghai. But same times, in the recent decades, people only remember Suzhou Creek as urban blight, as with the nickname Black and Stink. So in Chinese, Heichou. I remember in the 1990s, I lived in Shanghai, and Suzhou Creek is not anywhere that you want to get close to, or you want your address to be associated with. So there's a stigma with it. And it's not only a divide by itself, it's a mental boundary too, between the socially underrepresented district on the North Bank and the wealthy cosmopolitan district on the South. So in 2015, the combination of those two segregated districts created opportunity for designers like us to look at this linear feature or boundary could be reevaluated, could become something really celebrated in the city, and to unleash the potential of this otherwise physical divide. And not much different from most of the other urban rivers in China. You see it's pretty much blocked by industrial uses, infrastructure, and a narrow space in between, and a 2-meter tall flood wall. And it provides no visual or pedestrian connectivity. And let's look at the residential neighborhoods similar to those new cities. They're designed to ignore the water, even though the water is right at the edge, and the fence is built right along the edge. Even by removing the edge, the neighborhood has no intention to react with the water. So apparently there's other need that for designer to intervene to not only remove the physical boundary, you need to really make the neighborhoods open, and by remove that perceived boundaries. And while we were doing design, the new towers started encroaching towards the river. So it was desperately need a holistic framework to really advocate for a public realm and open space. Just to avoid making the same mistake of having that solid wall along the public open space. And that this was the vision that we created. So you see there are two interacting linear corridors, but I'm going to rewind and explain the logic behind it. So everyone else was focusing on this, trying to fit the program in this linear waterfront, because when people talk about a waterfront, that's what you see, that's the boundary, that's the scope you're given. But for us, instead, we look at the block by block social data as well as circulation study, and we strategically pull the water edge out into the neighborhood. So one way this you can overcome the social stigma that Suzhou Creek has created a long time ago. And then at the same time, it's not a random. This is connecting all the major urban nodes, infrastructure, including the central Shanghai station and public parks. So it creates an episode of different activities. And the space between these two the red line, which is urban frontage, and the green line along the river, which is the recreational corridor, becomes the public realm. That as the connecting tissue between the new frontage or new address of Fuzhou Creek and the open space corridor. And instead of supporting private solid development along the river, so this trying to maximize open space along the river. And so the industrial buildings are preserved to not only celebrate the heritage of the entire site, and they become the social art destination that responding to the already quite successful art district on the other side of the creek. And as you see, the ground floor of some of the industrial buildings, warehouses, open up as an extension of the landscape, and that provide a permeable a public realm to connect from the train station all the way to the river. And so it not only connects all the activities along the creek, it also extends into the neighborhood and the existing parks in the city. So to create a dialogue between the city and the new waterfront. And then the gated neighborhood again, so we're opening it up, but not only by simply removing the physical boundary, we're adding, we're intervening with the preservation as well as a new program, for example, by adding, inserting, extending, and connecting new program, so it becomes a vibrant, open community with a mixed use, with a strong corridor and view indication towards the creek. And then instead of generic semi-private open space in gated neighborhoods, and the new community center and the community parks become the social hub that is not only recreational, and that's where people interact, instead of, remember that Beijing neighborhood that you cannot even cross the street, and that lasts for 500 meters long. So those are the examples that we designers often battle against boundaries. This example that sometimes we reinforce or reestablish as well. So, for example, the nature doesn't follow any boundaries. For example, water only follows the law of gravity, and not at all care how we divide the urban fabric. So most of the wetland and river corridors in Chinese cities are engineered these days with the concrete embankments with very little ecological functions or aesthetic value. But instead, we maximize the riparian zones more than 5 times to reverse that simplification process by reintroducing habitat, by reintroducing wetland, so the nature can work for us to purify water, to provide ecosystem services. And this is how through a layperson's eyes to see this landscape. So instead of having an artificial boundary on top of the natural boundary, we reinforce it. Let's use boundaries to make the world more diverse. Thank you.